All right, ladies and gentlemen, we still have people connecting with us for the webinar that we're going to start now, but we are going to get going so that we can use the time we have allotted for this webinar. So first of all, welcome to everyone for joining us this afternoon to talk about digital futures for Europe and a mapping of scenarios for digital ecosystems and entrepreneurship. I'm particularly happy to welcome Meelis Kitsing, who is a good friend of ECIPE and a professor and rector of the Estonia Business School. Meelis has worked for various parts of the Estonian government and for the country's parliament, and has a very distinguished academic career, which started with a PhD at the University of Massachusetts. He has published a lot and is currently focused quite a lot in his research on the political economy of digital platform ecosystems. And this, of course, is also what we're going to talk about here today. Meelis will also soon have a new book out on this very subject, and we will share in the chat function a flyer or a link to the flyer where you can learn more about the book and also order a copy, which of course I advise every one of you to do. Meelis's publications are usually not just very good in terms of quality, but also very accessible and something that you don't need to have a PhD in economics in order to understand and access. So I strongly advise you to get a copy there. Last but not least, I should also say that you have another opportunity to read more from Meelis as well if you log on to our website, because we've just published a paper by Meelis with the same title as the event that we have today. And in that paper, Meelis is discussing the digital platform economy, and he outlines a few scenarios and ideas for Europe going forward. We should also make sure that we share the link to that paper in the chat function as well. So we're going to kick this webinar off with a presentation by Meelis, and that will be followed by a short conversation between him and me. And then we're going to open up for comments and questions from you in the audience. And I suppose all of you are already experts on the Zoom event drill by now. So you know that you can actually use the chat functions to make a comment or even raise a question. And that means that I'm going to try to pick it up and direct it to Meelis. But you can also raise your hand if you want to ask your questions or make your comment yourself. And then when we get to that part of the event, we hopefully can get as many of you as possible to actually participate, because that's really what we want to do. So that is all for me for the moment. Meelis, very much again, thank you for joining us for this afternoon. Thank you for writing an excellent paper for us. And let's see what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frederick. It's a pleasure to be back at the European Center for International Political Economy. Well, obviously, this time I could not travel to Brussels, which is, too bad. But I'm joining you from the new studio of Estonian Business School, from the center of Tallinn, which is capital of Estonia. So yeah, let me say briefly about this work on the digital futures for Europe. This is actually something that we did in the last year at the Estonian Parliament at the Foresight Center, where with a group of experts we generated a number of scenarios for Europe, and we were particularly interested in what are the implications of those scenarios for Europe. So since I am at the can I share this? Okay, now it works. Okay, sorry, I think it's with a slight delay. So, so since I am at the European Center for International Political Economy, let me start with international political economy perspectives. I think that when we think about the futures, digital futures for Europe, obviously we cannot ignore what happens in the broader global context. I think a lot of the issues that we're sort of talking here about in Europe, about technological sovereignty, about regulation of platforms, taxation, digital tax, and so on, digital trade, in one way or another way, relate to global developments, relate to the international political economy. Obviously, it's a highly complex topic, but I do think that some of the perspectives we have developed in international political economy approaches over the last decades are a little bit helpful in summing it up, what is actually going on. I mean, one of the key debates in international political economy has been about relative and absolute gains. And I think it's also relevant for understanding digitalization and digital trade. I mean, one way to think about that is that, we could focus very much on the fact that if you look at the largest digital platforms in the world by the stock market valuation, then most of them come from the US and a few of them come from China. There are basically no comparable digital platforms in Europe. And we could say that, look, in relative sense, we in Europe, we're kind of losing out because those are Chinese and those are American platforms and we have nothing. So that's sort of, our position vis-a-vis Americans and Chinese. But we could also think about it in terms of absolute gains. So basically, it's great that we have companies like Microsoft in the world because they don't only employ people in United States, but they do also employ people in Europe, in countries like France. So it's not bad to have maybe companies such as Amazon and Alibaba because they don't only deliver consumer surplus in the United States, but they also do deliver goods to the places like Estonia, for instance. So that gives us sort of the understanding of absolute gains, that even if we have those great platforms coming from US, coming from China, we can still, in one way or another way, benefit by interacting globally and delivering services and goods that people do want. So this is, and obviously it's not a black and white world. So it's not that we can, we have to focus either on absolute or relative. This is, I think it's really more like a spectrum, in the sense that in the one end of the spectrum, you could have, let's say, digital autarky, where the focus is primarily on the relative gains, our position vis-a-vis others. Another end of the spectrum, you could have sort of unilateral free digital trade, where the focus is primarily on absolute gains, that everybody benefits from cooperation and openness and so on. And I think the main issues that we're sort of dealing with are somewhere there in the middle of the spectrum, finding a proper balance, So we have, debates about, it's not just about mercantilism or protectionism, digital mercantilism or protectionism. There are also different versions of that. The mercantilism could be more malign. It could be more benevolent, nicer. So it's kind of like finding a proper balance. So there are lots of, let's say, lots of shades and gray there. I'm not sort of trying to say here that it's only black and white, absolute versus relative, and we either focus on them. So it's more a question of, what are the things that we do care most about. And then obviously from international political economy, you have this sort of stylized ways how to sort of show some of the interactions by using game theory. I think more recently, if you look at the digital issues with China, US and China are basically playing something which is called a prisoner's dilemma, not just in the game theoretic terms, but if you think about the Huawei, quite literally. So quite directly, actually, they are playing that. But it doesn't mean that all, again, like it's not completely black and white world. It's just like a stylized way how to sort of think about some of those interactions. It doesn't necessarily mean that all interactions between the United States and China are characterized by that type of game. For instance, they obviously both would benefit, and I think there are on both sides sort of sufficient incentives to collaborate on the issues related to the climate change. There are also still quite significant sort of investments, capital flows. Some of the Silicon Valley venture capital firms such as Draper, Fisher, Jurvenson have been early investors in some of the Chinese platforms such as Baidu. So I think there are also sort of, depending on the issue area related to the digitalization we're looking at, it's not maybe always this simplistic game theoretic prisoner's dilemma that they're playing. There could be also some other games. You know, maybe some of the cooperation is also more similar to the ways EU and United States interact. I think this is more a game which is often known called Battle of Sexes that you also have there on the slide, where sort of multiple equilibria are possible in the sense that it's more of sort of finding a balance between, let's say, a trade interest and security interest. I mean, obviously, the plans that the European Union currently have concerning digital taxation may not always sort of be beneficial for other forms of cooperation with the United States if it's going to, you know, basically somehow anger our allies. And so this is sort of a different type of game we are playing. So you have this, my point here is that you have this sort of various international political economy perspectives that are sort of necessary to factor in if you sort of think about the digital futures in Europe. My second point is that if you look at the policy literature, management literature, sort of economics literature, and also, you know, on the issues on the ground, you see that there is actually what can be described as a great technology debate. I mean, obviously, there is a lot of things written over the last decades about digital ecosystems, digital platforms, network effects, winner-take-it-all economies, and so on. But if I would sort of try to sum it up, some of the key debates is that it's not just about technology, right? So it's not just about the technology, whether people are optimistic about technology or less optimistic about the technology. To the great extent, the debate is also about social consequences of the technology, or political and economic consequences of the technology, of trends such as platformization and so on. And here is a simple way how maybe sort of try to summarize debate. As you can see that it's actually also, there are quite a lot of dimensions to it, quite a lot of different perspectives. In one hand, people can be both, you know, they can be optimistic about technology. They can agree that, you know, platformization and digitalization has a great potential for many different industries, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they will agree on the social consequences of digital platformization, for instance. You know, some people tend to be more optimistic, basically saying that, yes, in some areas, some of the jobs disappear, but there will be more jobs created. Others could be more pessimistic, basically saying that, you know, the job losses are sort of greater than the new jobs are created. And then obviously there are also people who maybe don't see the current digital revolution as important as some other sort of technological revolutions have taken place. So again, you get a lot of different perspectives. It's not just that you have one view of the future or one understanding of the current trends. You know, something published by, let's say, by McKinsey saying that many jobs will disappear in the next 5 years, and that's the final word on it. But you actually get the variety of the different perspectives, and I think that needs to be factored in as well. And all of that means that we are sort of dealing with uncertainty and complexity. I mean, we don't have, we have different understanding of the past developments, current trends, meaning of them. And particularly as we sort of look into the future, it's even more so. And, you know, uncertainty and complexity, you know, I think Nassim Nicholas Taleb has made it famous that we're talking about black swans, events that are not, you know, very likely to happen, but they may actually have a huge consequences, what they happen. And similarly, we can also talk about sort of, different colors of pandas. Most people, if you ask them that, what color is a panda? Panda is this nice animal there, black and white, but you also have red pandas. So our mental models in a way and sort of biases we have tend to think us in a particular way, but we could basically take a broader approach and have a wider range of understanding what the future might hold for us. And here is a illustration of that. Usually I think economists or and many other social scientists tend to think in terms of forecasting, where you probably think about what is probable, what is likely to happen, but actually limits our alternatives. And obviously also entrepreneurs tend to think also in terms of what is preferable, but what is preferable doesn't necessarily mean that it's also something that will happen or is likely to happen in the future. And here is an illustration for that from London School of Economics in 2008, where Queen Elizabeth II visited it, and I asked from economists there, how come that you did not see the great financial crisis coming? And that illustration is from the Financial Times. And those economists talked about it a little bit, and then they responded with a letter where they said basically that it was a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people. So this sort of scenario thinking is not limited only what is preferable and what is probable, but you're also thinking in terms of what is possible and what is plausible. Okay, so and for that, usual methods of just taking the current trends and drawing the trend line to the sum of to the future, they don't work. But there is a necessity to think in terms of wider range of options. And when I have been thinking about scenario planning and doing some work in scenario planning, then I think I used to share this view that this is something that really large organizations such as Shell, which is a pioneer in this field, Royal Dutch Shell, the oil energy company, sometimes it's called Shell Method. This is something that very large organizations do, European Union or some governments, OECD and so on. But increasingly, I think in the situation of COVID, I think this approach has proved to be more relevant to basically all the organizations and also for the individuals. Because of uncertainty and complexity, it's very difficult to have only one view of the future, but you have to think about futures. So that's why we use it in plural. So that's why the title of my talk is in plural. It's not because my English grammar is limited, and I'm not using future in singular, but it's on purpose that we emphasize the futures, alternative futures. Just to give you one sort of real life example, last summer we hosted a party in a small island of Ruhnu in Estonia, which is a very remote island, and that was in the end of June, and we planned for this party in March. Where we were in the middle of the lockdown, right? So, and if you plan for a party like that, then you're dealing with uncertainties about the future, a few months ahead. I mean, obviously one uncertainty is COVID, right? So you don't know how the COVID situation will evolve. Will be people actually able to travel to the island? It's a 3 hours by ferry from the mainland Estonia. And another uncertainty you're dealing with in this part of the world, and Frederick knows it very well, is the weather. Even in the summer, you're going to be sure that the weather will be nice. So it probably means that if you can, by mapping those two uncertainties, you can actually generate like 4 different scenarios, right? I mean, one option is that you have COVID situation is really bad and weather is really bad, right? And that means that you cannot travel to this island basically. And then if you rent something there, you have to, and if you buy ferry tickets, you have to make sure that you can somehow get your money back basically, right? Luckily for us, the weather was great, and COVID situation also allowed us to travel there. In that sense, the most preferable scenario materialized, but you also have to be ready to the alternatives, because at that point, when you plan it in March for June, you don't actually know. So this is just a small example where in everyday life, it also helps to think in terms of scenarios and to be ready and have sort of robust decision-making that goes with it, rather than rely on one single vision. So at the Estonian Parliament last year, with number of contributions from MPs and other decision makers, and also from the experts, we did a scenario exercise and talked in terms of what digitalization, among other things, will mean for Europe, and what are the sort of the key, the key drivers that should go into that type of scenario exercise. And those key drivers, obviously you can think in terms of like many possible futures, and there could be lots of different key drivers. But I think in this scenario work, it's important to limit yourself to what is plausible, right? So it's not, not just to the probable, not just to the preferable, but also plausible. And we kind of excluded what is possible. I mean, lots of things are possible, but we excluded those factors. Another sort of factor I think here that is really important is to focus on things that will have a high impact. Okay, so not lots of things can happen, but not all of them will have high impact. And according to our expert groups, we decided to focus on two key uncertainties, which can be also called key drivers. This is the EU cooperation, what kind of shape the EU cooperation will have, and also the state of the infrastructure, right? And by that we mean all kind of infrastructure very broadly. Obviously, the digital is not just about the cyberspace, it's also about lots of physical connections and so on. And infrastructure development is not just about financing the infrastructure, but it's also about new ideas, innovation, research and development. It's also about social attitudes. Will people actually want this type of infrastructure development? Because it also means digging some holes somewhere, putting up some antennas and so on. It's also about, in many ways, sort of technological anxiety. So some people may feel that the world is moving too fast for them. In one hand, for instance, in Estonia, we have lots of unicorns, about 7 unicorns now for 1.3 million people, which is great. And lots of people from all over the world have moved here to work for those unicorns. But at the same time, we also do have a populist party, which is not anymore in the government, but which is still highly popular. I think they ranked 3rd by the opinion polls, which is very skeptical about immigration. So there is this sort of a populist type of backlash as well. And I think that also must, those sort of social attitudes must go into that type of work as well. So, and we generated basically 4 scenarios by combining those key drivers. And let me just very briefly, before we go to the discussion part, where we can discuss a little bit more about the implications and so on, let me just sort of outline some of the scenarios. I mean, the first scenario is a Compass Europe. And in this scenario, basically you have advanced digital infrastructure, and you also have a strong EU cooperation. And this cooperation also focus on basically helping European entrepreneurs to be more successful in the world. There are heavy investments into the digital infrastructure. Europe is important in setting regulatory standards in the world. You could basically call this scenario sort of Brussels effect. There is a book written by that, and European Center for International Political Economy had some time ago also a special event dedicated to this book. But you could see this, that, you know, that it's not just in Europe where Europe will be European cooperation and digitalization will be important, but it's also something that will happen, will have sort of global consequences, and Europe is an important player here, in addition to China and United States and other players. Then we have scenario number 2, where in one hand you have a strong European cooperation, but on the other hand, you don't have sort of sufficient developments in the digital world, or in investments in infrastructure and so on. And in this scenario, basically, the EU cooperation does not focus so much on making Europe greater in the world, but it's more about protectionism. It's more about protectionism in the broadest sense. It's more about sort of social Europe. So the emphasis of the cooperation are in a different area, and less so on the technological advancements and technological development. And again, like here, the growth prospects obviously are limited. The entrepreneurial opportunities from companies from Europe are more limited than in the previous scenario. You're dealing with overregulation, taxation, and so on. So instead of Brussels effect, from the point of view of digital platforms, you're dealing more with sort of Brussels defect. Let's put it that way. So then we have a scenario where you both have a weak EU cooperation, so there are not sufficient incentives for the EU to cooperate, and you also have very limited investments in the digital infrastructure. So this is a scenario where you have no or minimal growth, no benefits that would stem from the rapid digitalization. But again, this sort of very peaceful society may be sort of desirable. And sort of slow-moving society, sort of slow growth, may be desirable for some of the social groups that I have sort of tried to refer to before. So the world is not moving that fast. Maybe you have less of technological anxiety, but obviously, as a result, you also have less resources to be invested in health, education, and so on. So, and then we developed a scenario, what we call a fast and curious. And in this scenario, you have a weak EU cooperation, but you still have quite a rapid advancement of digital in at least in the parts of Europe. And in this scenario, particularly, we focused on Northern Europe. And that can come from a number of different ways. It can come from a stronger cooperation with the United States. You know, basically Europe is split in this scenario. There are some parts of the Europe who focus more on cooperation with China, investment in digital infrastructure from China. And then there are other parts of Europe that focus more on working with large American companies and platforms. So the role of the private sector, role of the cities, particularly here, is way greater. And national governments and sort of EU-level cooperation plays a smaller role. So that it will be kind of very uneven development across Europe in terms of digitalization. Some parts of Europe, particularly in the north, have a very rapid development, while others very much sort of lag behind. So this is my very brief introduction to some of the work we have been doing here with the help of a number of experts from Estonia and other countries on the scenarios. And you know, obviously, I didn't have sufficient time to go into all the details. I just sort of tried to give you a rough outline. Some of that I have expanded on in my policy brief that I have contributed to the ECIPE but also even longer discussions and more details are available in the book. But obviously now we can go and expand on that with help of Frederick. So I'm sure that you have lots of questions, and I will be happy to answer and to discuss them. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Meelis, for kicking us off with your initial thoughts. Very good. The next step before opening up for questions and comments from the audience is that I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the specifics of these different scenarios and try to lay out a little bit what they entail, and perhaps also what you think is more plausible than others. I mean, I think reading your paper and looking and listening to your presentations, I think it's possible to find that current developments in different parts of Europe can touch upon all these 4 different scenarios, and it's not as if there is sort of a clear development going in one particular direction here. But let's start a little bit first with discussing on the broader environmental factors that lead you to think about these issues. I mean, one thing that I've dealt with a bit recently is when you look at factors that I suppose would come into your definition of strong or advanced infrastructure, thinking about the underlying capabilities that exist here before we go in discussing regulatory developments or how you position or how governments are positioning themselves on issues that concerns openness or less openness towards technological competition. So we have a paper coming out in a few weeks where we look at the lack of supply of human capital, of advanced digital human capital in Europe, pointing to, for instance, that there is currently, or there was, a vacancy in Germany of IT specialists amounting to roughly 125,000. When you look around Europe and when you look at the Commission trying to estimate the gap in terms of the supply of highly skilled digital labor and the demand for highly skilled digital labor, you see that there is a very, very substantial gap there. Demand exceeds supply quite radically. If you take into account that many parts of Europe is facing an adverse demographic development, with many economies are actually going to have a cut in the number of labor supply in the next decade or the next 2 decades, and that will probably happen even if you take into account that there's going to be substantial net migration coming from other parts of the world into Europe. Now, it's not very easy these days to find highly skilled digital human capital just waiting to get employed. Almost everyone that graduates from university with these type of skills get an employment right away. It's not as if you have lots of skilled engineers in India, China, or other parts of the world that are as eager to start to take up a work in Europe or America as they were perhaps a decade ago. So I wanted us to start by getting into these infrastructural conditions. One part of it is the hard infrastructure, which I think you mentioned with digital networks. The other factor, of course, is soft infrastructure issues, like, for instance, the supply of digital labor. So how do you weigh in that type of development in your scenarios? To what extent should Europe be worried about problems of finding human capital to actually deliver the type of change that in one way or the other inevitably will come?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Frederick. And obviously, this sort of the concept of infrastructure here is a really broad, and it also includes the soft infrastructure that you mentioned. But I guess I didn't articulate it very concretely when presenting. But it's not just about physical infrastructure in that sense, but it's also about human capital and obviously if you talk about innovation, research and development, and human capital plays a very crucial role there. And here in Estonia, we also have this issue. You know, as I mentioned, we have quite a lot of unicorns and other sort of wonderful companies, startup companies, and they're all looking for you know, talent. They're all looking for the human capital, and in that sense, you know, being a small country with limited number of people, then you know, they do turn to the other countries and try to attract talent from other countries, which is of course quite difficult in the sense that immigration regulations are not always favorable for that, even though that there has been some you know, progress, particularly concerning startups and so on. You also have questions related to the taxation. You know, the taxes on labor are quite high, and I think that's not just the case in Estonia, but that's in general also in Europe. So you know, those are just some of the issues. Obviously, there are like a number of other issues. Yeah, I mean, in addition to immigration, obviously, how do you attract skills and people to work in this area? I think it's also important to emphasize constant sort of relearning, constant lifelong education. I think still in many places we operate with the model that when people go to after high school to the university, they will get their degree and then they will go to work somewhere, and that's it. But I think we need to think in terms of constantly relearning new skills, and I think it relates quite well to this great technology debate that I introduced in one of my slides, because if you sort of think about the future, then it's probably easy to imagine jobs, you know, as many organizations do, World Economic Forum and McKinsey and others, imagine jobs or job functions that will disappear in the future because of technology, right? That's a little bit more easier, but it's much more difficult to imagine what kind of jobs might be created in the future, right? And in that sense, it's probably not the best strategy to assume that people go to university, they graduate from the university, and then they can sort of come from the ready-made skill set that, you know, they are sort of set for life with that, but what rather that they will learn at the university how to learn, and through constant relearning, they can sort of acquire new skills. If there are changes in the labor market, there is more demand for a certain set of skills, it's possible to also learn new things and contribute to those developments. And it's, I mean, in a way, it's a policy issue that you make that type of lifelong learning possible, that you have less sort of formalistic approach to education. It's also about companies. For instance, here in Estonia, some of the unicorns, such as Wise, formerly TransferWise, and some others, their founders have set up a coding school in northeastern Estonia. So it's a private sector initiative. So it's also about employers thinking in those terms, that they're not just getting their future employees through the public education system, but it's also about intrinsic kind of motivation that people have. I mean, some of the research work I have done before while living in the US was about open source software development, where I got to interview lots of people from all over the world who were part of developing different projects. And they're all kind of interesting people. You may have people with PhDs in math. You may have people with no formal education, basically. But you could also have people who have PhDs in anthropology, who have taught themselves how to code and develop particular type of open source solutions that they actually needed for their work, and they were part of this community. So I mean, this sort of diversity, I think people, you know, in one hand you have more movement, people are coming in, more people can come in who have the skills to Europe, but also people who are here constantly upgrading their skills. I think that's probably the answer. And you know, in addition to the technological development, that some of the things that we now do as humans may not be so in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think Meelis, that one of the reasons I asked that question is that I know that both you and I had to sit through a number of lectures at the London School of Economics in International Political Economy, where we were taught about on the basis of a book called Commerce and Coalitions, and how you can basically define the willingness to be open, or the willingness to lean towards sort of free trade or more protectionism on the basis of whether you have excess supply of one production factor. So if you think about this in a digital model here, so we have not just Europe, where it's a short supply of digital human capital, and we let's say we treat digital human capital as a big endowment, but we have more of a global shortage of supply here. So what does that tell us about directions going forward? Will it make us more open or less open? You could on the one hand think that, well, you know, given that we have a short supply of labor, we should be as open as possible, because if we cannot really get the staff we need in order to produce, well, then we need to import. Either we need to import labor, or we need to import the technologies or the goods and services that use this technology, or possibly you can go in the other direction, making you more protectionist.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as you have aging populations and so on, and you have less sort of skilled labor, you know, at least according to this kind of theoretical approach, it would point towards that you would have you know, basically more demand for protectionism, right? So that you know, we can also see that in some of the markets or ecosystems in Europe. I mean, if you think about, for instance, Copenhagen, Denmark. In one hand, Denmark is a wonderful country. It's often given as this sort of model for others. They have this sort of flexi security, and they have lots of interesting policy innovations, also lots of sort of entrepreneurial companies. But if you would want to use ride sharing in Copenhagen, it wouldn't be possible, right? Because you know, they haven't allowed this particular innovation in their city. Well, it's likely because if you sort of think about it in a sort of very rational, choicey terms, it's because of winners and losers. So losers kind of have blocked it, and certain services, Airbnb is available, but ride sharing is not available. But again, like I think those books you're mentioning, you know, Commerce and Coalitions and so on, they're perhaps a little bit, from my perspective, they're perhaps a little bit too reductionist, or sort of too rational, choicey, and you know, perhaps also a little bit like too deterministic. You know, again, like it's not always. I mean, it's a huge debate on its own, how exactly people perceive their interest and how exactly act on their interest. And I think there is a much more sort of complexity and an uncertainty there. But as a sort of simplified model, it's probably like a good way how to think about it. And then I guess the target is that how to convince those people who might perceive technology or technological developments or platformization as a threat, how to convince them that actually they could potentially benefit, or their children could benefit, and so on. And it's obviously not an easy task. But there are more optimistic perspectives as well, I want to emphasize. I mean, you have just before the COVID, you have a book by David Soskich about how also sort of educated labor force could be important for progressive sort of social change. It's called Democracy and Prosperity. David Soskich is now also at LSE. So I mean, yeah, again, like I wouldn't want to sort of only sort of focus on one particular perspective. I think like there are basically debates, as I sort of tried to highlight, on those issues, what it exactly might mean. Thanks.
And what about industrial structure? Thinking about sort of what different European countries come with in terms of their recent history, looking at the share of multinationals, what type of multinationals, is it sort of industrial ones or services oriented? To what extent do you think that plays a role for defining not just sort of broader positions, if you want to be open or less open on technology, but also the extent to which you can create an atmosphere and broader environment where you stimulate entrepreneurial growth in the digital economy? I mean, if we think about some of the successes in Europe in digital economy, like for instance Estonia, it's a country where you don't have many big multinationals. It's not that you come sort of with a strong incumbency advantage of many old industries that want to protect their advantages against new competition that comes from technological startups, etc. You can find many other countries that have sort of a high share of unicorn per population, that it's basically sort of a similar type of pattern there. And I'd include my mother country there as well, which has a high number of unicorns per population, in the sense that many of them may have competed with incumbents, but many of these incumbents haven't felt as if they have been advantaged by policy, in the sense they are protected against change by policy. On the other hand, we can point to sort of many countries around Europe where the industrial heritage is much stronger, and where there is an inclination perhaps to be more protective against, or at least more defensive, when it comes to being open to technological change. So what do you say? I mean, is industrial structure sort of the history of entrepreneurship? Is that something which sort of is important when we're defining how countries tend to position themselves? What can countries do in order to, if that is the case, what can countries do to sort of open up for more digital entrepreneurship?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think it is important. But obviously, digitalization is not just about digitalization in services, right? I mean, the startups we see here in Estonia, they often have a sort of like a service focus. You have Wise, formerly TransferWise, it's financial services. You have Bolt, that's ride sharing. You have ECIPE, I guess telecommunications, and so on. I mean, the list goes on. The digitalization is, for me, it's kind of horizontal technology, which kind of plays a role everywhere. And even if you think in terms of United States, for instance, if you compare, for instance, Boston area and Silicon Valley, I think they have somewhat sort of different focus. I mean, Boston is very good in kind of business to business, more sort of like engineering, science-oriented type of startups, while Silicon Valley is way better in sort of business to consumer type of services. For instance, Facebook was founded at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But they moved from there to Silicon Valley. We have also some sort of examples from Estonia and Estonian companies which kind of toyed with the ideas of moving either to Silicon Valley or Boston, and then since they were business to business, settled in Boston. So this is also services could be kind of like talked in that way. In terms of sort of, let's say, more traditional industries or manufacturing versus services, I think increasingly also manufacturing companies are not only doing manufacturing, they have very sort of strong services component, which can benefit from digitalization. Here in Estonia, actually, the biggest player is Ericsson, which is obviously also a big player in terms of exports, which is also a big player in Sweden, where you are at the moment. So in that sense, I think it's also possible to think in terms of platformization in the manufacturing industries, but it will be, this sort of idea is not just limited to the digital service companies, but it might be a little bit a different type of platformization. We don't know what type of platformization Platformization can mean lots of very different things. I mean, you may have more end-to-end platforms. They may be more specialized. You can have more open platforms. You may have also more closed platforms. So there is quite a lot of diversity. Actually, developing certain platforms in places like Germany, for instance, where they have very strong manufacturing base, could be one of the ways how Europe can move forward. So again, like the sort of, when I talk about digitalization and platforms, I don't want to limit it only to the digital service companies or what we now see as a lot of key players such as Amazon or Google. But I think sort of similar trends may actually happen in many different industries in one way or another. But how they exactly play out is certainly uncertainty. I mean, I don't know the future. I can sort of think in terms of what might be the possible alternatives, but where exactly it will go is unclear. Thanks.
Yes, no, indeed. And I think that applies to all of us. If we actually knew what was going to happen, we wouldn't be discussing it. We would be investing in it and making money.
Absolutely,
out of that development. But still, I mean, I think it's interesting perhaps to pause on that issue for a moment, because at least in the political debate, you can see that there is a huge occupation in the debate which are on sort of the known big platforms now, basically the GAFA group of companies. And there is sort of an underlying assumption that what is going to happen with the platformization of the economy in the future is basically that they're going to take up an increasing share of it. But sort of one of the points that you go into and discuss a little bit in the paper, and I think in the book, is that, well, when you actually look at the type of industrial applications that we could envisage in the future, even if we can't predict exactly which platform is going to succeed or what will going to happen to within different sectors in terms of how much they will be open to platformization. You still point out a couple of sectors where you think things are going to happen and where there is far greater openness for European companies to go in there, because we come with a strong industrial profile in these sectors, energy being one of them, for instance. So, I mean, stepping out of that world, sort of the digital services world, or at least the known platforms now, in what areas would you see, or would you imagine that platform developments could go?
Right. I mean, thanks. I mean, obviously, also in this sort of GAFA debate, I just want to add a little bit that again, like we could sort of look at the specific areas, and we see that in some areas, obviously, also the competition is intensifying. It's not just that. Because Google is not just about search anymore. They do a number of other things, and by doing so, they're also going increasingly in a direct competition with other big platforms. And in some areas, you also have companies that are maybe not so well known. I mean, for instance, if you think about e-commerce. Obviously Amazon has a huge share, but you also have traditional companies, like Walmart and others who have sort of moved into this area. If you think about video streaming, it's not only that you have Netflix, actually their market share has dropped, but you also have a bunch of other companies that come in, and we could go on by on. I mean, in cloud and so on. So you see also this sort of like a competition, I think, intensifying. It's it's probably still oligopolistic, but it's not a monopoly. So, but very few markets in the world, I mean, absolutely are perfect, or there is no. I mean, it's more like a ideal type or a sort of construct that we are talking about perfect markets in economics. So this is like one point about this sort of GAFA debate. So we cannot outrule that there will be more diversity, more decentralization in the future. But as far as Europe is concerned, one way also sort of to think in terms of where the future, what might be some of our strengths, obviously, is to also look at some of the sectors, where people from outside of Europe are investing. For instance, China has invested quite a lot in energy, also sort of agriculture, in addition to the sort of technology companies or Chinese companies have invested in Europe. And I think that since Europe has also those, EU has those policy goals focusing on sustainability issues, sort of green transformation, there is also potential there to increase the platformization and bring in the same logic. So one potential development could be that even if there are more and more sort of dominance, as we have seen in the last decades by US companies in the area of digital services, then sort of completely new fields could emerge that benefit by using the same sort of logic, also in sort of different areas. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you, Meelis. Let me also say that feel free, anyone in the audience, to raise your hand if you'd like to come in and discuss. I have received a couple of questions for you, which are also from you in the chat function, which I'm going to put to Meelis, but I'm more than happy to also share time with anyone from who is listening in to come in and ask a questions or make a comment. But to start with one of the questions. So, I mean, there is obviously a desired development where Europe and other leading parts of the world are going to converge in terms of the regulatory approach in order to avoid that we get sort of fragmentation of digital markets, and that we deprive both Europe and other parts of the world of the benefits that comes from being open in technology and using the benefits that come from being open. So do you think it's possible to get regulatory convergence, let's say with the United States or indeed China? Or is it more likely that Europe is going to charge its own regulatory future when it comes to the digital economy?
Yes, to some extent, maybe with the United States. It's to a very limited extent, I believe. I think it's a challenge. I know that, for instance, currently that there are those sort of negotiations over digital tax, but I think there are still like lots of uncertainties there. How it plays out in practice, what the U.S. Congress will say, and so on. I think it will be very limited in that sense at best. So I think it will be important for both the United States and EU to strengthen the cooperation in this field. But I think it will be limited. With China, it's difficult to imagine in the current environment how it might sort of work out and look because of given the current tensions, maybe something in very general terms, but again, probably it will be open to the very different interpretations. It's more symbolic. I think with China we are sort of again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to focus on the sort of like a black and white scenarios, cooperation, no cooperation. It's probably the wisest strategy would be engagement, but kind of calculated, very careful engagement It doesn't necessarily mean appeasement, doing whatever other side wants. So careful engagement is probably a reasonable strategy. Sometimes, in those relations with China, this metaphor of Cold War, new Cold War is used. Personally, I disagree with this analogy. I think China is much more sort of integrated with the world economy, plays important role in the global value chains in many sort of key technologies and so on. And it's very difficult to have this sort of Cold War type of system. Plus also technologies have advanced quite a lot. And I think even in the Cold War, you had this sort of like technology transfer control regimes and so on. It's kind of difficult to foresee how could this be applied, to the same extent in the current context. So at least my perspective is not based on this sort of Cold War analogy that sometimes we can find in different outlets in relations with China.
Yeah. Another question. So you outlined 4 different scenarios. Do you have sort of a scenario yourself that you think is more likely than the other scenarios, or do you think there will be sort of a combination of different scenarios? And if that's the case, what will the composition of these combinations look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I talked here about sort of plausible and probable and preferable. From my perspective, I think the preferable scenario would be what we call the Compass Europe, where you have both sort of significant development in IT infrastructure and also strong EU cooperation in this area. That would be the preferable, but that's not probably, but it's probably not the most likely scenario to put it, because we see quite a lot of difficulties in the EU cooperation. If you even think of some of the issues, for instance, here in Estonia, I think we are relatively less concerned about privacy than maybe some other countries. For instance, Germany is much more focused on sort of privacy issues that come with data. It's very difficult to develop business models in this area where you don't have sort of sufficient access to the data, or data is very highly regulated, and there are huge sort of social and regulatory concerns about that. So in this sense, it's probably like more likely that we don't have sufficient cooperation in this area, and Europe will be somewhat more sort of fragmented, at least looking at the current trends. But again, this is just my intuition, and I can be wrong. I think that's sort of the whole point of the exercise, that you step out of your own comfort zone of your own confirmation bias, and sort of try to think also about the possible worlds that might happen in the future.
Another question related to that. I mean, you spoke about optimism or pessimism on technology. So where are we right now in this particular debate? Do we have a policy which is infused by optimism about what technology can generate, or are we pessimistic about the social consequences that they will lead to?
I see that there has been, particularly where I come from and where I have been, I see that there has been a lot of sort of technological determinism, or sort of lots of hopes about technology, and people certainly come from this sort of, lots of policymakers, they come from this sort of very technologically optimistic perspective, basically thinking that with technology you could solve some of the social issues, or You can develop app here and there. I think this sort of emphasis on what are the social consequences of technological development, there probably the dominant view is more towards sort of like a pessimism, in the sense that yes, you may have. So I think this is the dominant view, that in one hand you're technologically optimist, that technology has this sort of great potential, but at the same time you're concerned about social consequences. And I think it's also easier for the type of thinking that people usually engage in, as I sort of emphasized before. It's much easier to see that what you're going to lose. I mean, we have a kind of biases, what kind of jobs might be lost and so on, and what kind of developments might happen in the future that are negative, but it's much more difficult to imagine what are some of the positive trends happening out there as a result of technological advancements. So yeah, I mean, technological optimism, but sort of like a social pessimism, I think, is sort of dominant paradigm, at least what I tend to see.
All right. Question on tax and the current debate we're having on digital taxation. We also, I should say, we're getting close to the end of the event. So in the sort of, if somewhere you want to come in and say your own thing, you really need to raise your hand now, because otherwise we won't have time for it. But questions on tax. So first one, if Europe goes ahead with the taxation of American platforms and platforms from other parts of the world, for that matter, or other services providers, do you think there is a risk that companies like Facebook and Google can basically respond by limiting their service and their use in Europe?
That's certainly a risk. I think it's particularly, also in the smaller markets, maybe less so in the larger markets. I think there are many more risks than that. I think the risk is that, again, like, I don't want to go into details here, but Matthias at the European Center for International and Political Economy has done some great papers on that. There are also other risks that, it may signal to the Americans kind of trade tensions, and there may be retaliation by the Americans. In general, it may not be very good for building a transatlantic cooperation. And so I think those are the risks as well. I think the preferable, basically there are three options concerning tax. One is not to do anything, basically leave it as it is, or another option is to do it on a European level. There was an attempt to do that some years ago, but it was not successful, particularly because some countries opposed to that. And then there is a third option where everybody does it on their own. And I think the third option is actually the worst, because it fragments. One of the issues we have in Europe is this scalability. We already have huge cultural differences, scalability of platforms and so on. We have huge cultural differences, some regulatory and other differences. And now by everybody doing their digital taxes on their own, you're basically going to balkanize this sort of European common digital market even more. So I think that's, what has happened in the last couple of years is probably the worst possible outcome. And it's not. There are many reasons why don't we have such great companies as Google or Amazon in Europe, but the scalability issue and sort of regulatory kind of fragmentation is, it's probably like one of the reasons. Thanks.
All right. Finally, Meelis, this is a big question for you, but I know it's impossible to answer in the few minutes we have left, but why don't you at least get going on it? So basically what we would like to see is a development where we have lots more of entrepreneurial digital growth in Europe, where more creations of European platforms that compete with platforms around the world, where we keep borders open for competition and accessing technologies that we can't produce on our own, or at least not in the same way as we could by accessing more efficient producers abroad. So what is it that we need to do then in order to improve the general environment for digital entrepreneurship growth in Europe? I mean, you mentioned already one thing now, which is on avoiding fragmentation to at least make it easier to scale in Europe. What does that entail? What type of policies are we talking about then that are needed in order to improve the European environment for platform growth?
I mean, I think in general, it relates to environment. Of course, like European countries are all very different. It might depend also on the particular country, but in general, it relates to this entrepreneurial environment in a sort of like a broadest sense. I mean, and it's not just about taxes and regulation, it's also about mindset. So there are lots of sort of tacit factors that that are not easily measurable or easily even easy to communicate about, but you kind of have to go and experience them to understand their importance, and lots of tacit factors that are important, and in general sort of encourage this entrepreneurial discovery processes in a number of ways by having less regulatory barriers, or having less all kind of other barriers. I think that's sort of the key. Again, environments are different in Europe. It may mean more emphasis on particular set of policies in some other places, and so on. But I think that's broadly what we need to sort of think about it, that what makes entrepreneurs do things, what are their incentives, and how policy can support that. Obviously there are also certain risks as we look ahead in Europe, with all the massive investments that are planned in green and digital transformation. There is also a risk that instead of sort of proper value grading entrepreneurship, there will be lots of rent seeking. So that also requires to think in terms of where the money will be allocated, the public money will be allocated. Is it really sort of creating value, or is it just a misallocation that doesn't help the entrepreneurship? That's very briefly. I mean, that's a big topic.
It's a big topic indeed.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on it, sort of, capital markets, do we have problems with funding situation in Europe? Is that an issue that we need to talk about? Labor markets, human capital supply, improving educational system for entrepreneurial changes. Would you also include that type of policies, or more?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. They are all there. So I purposefully sort of changed. Purposefully sort of stayed on a more general level, not to go to this sort of a long list of policy issues, but certainly all of those are important. I mean, here, obviously capital markets are important. Obviously education is important. Maybe just to end it here, at the Estonian Business School, we are heavily thinking in terms of how to, sort of think about the future of education. This sort of lifelong learning, constant skills development is really crucial, and we are thinking very much in those terms, that how we can contribute to this ecosystem, that and how the education would be less formalistic and sort of relevant for future entrepreneurs.
All right, very good. Let us indeed end on that note, Meelis, not just end it on Estonian Business School, which is a very impressive business school in Europe, not least for the way that you are behaving as entrepreneurs yourself. But also end it on a note that there is a lot of things that can be done in order to improve the entrepreneurial environment in Europe, to make sure that we generate more companies and startups here. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Meelis, and listening to your presentation. It was a great privilege to have you publishing a paper with us. Let us just reinforce that point that we have shared in the chat function a link to Meelis's paper. You can also find it on ECIPE's website. There is also in the chat function a link to the book that Meelis is very soon publishing, and you can make an advance order there, which I strongly advise you all to do. Let me thank everyone that have joined this seminar. And in particular, Meelis, I'd like to thank you. Thanks for taking the time and being with us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, Frederick. Thanks for hosting this seminar. It was really a pleasure to be here. And thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thanks for contributing, and thanks for taking the time to listen. And if you have any additional questions, anything that I can help with, then please do let me know. Have a great afternoon. We have afternoon here, so I hope you have afternoon too, or if you don't have afternoon, then evening, morning, whatever you have. Yeah.
Thank you very much.